This is episode 54 of the After Gambling podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by recovering gambler and author Tom Brew to discuss his struggles and now triumphs in gambling recovery, and also his new book that's coming out today. Hey there, and welcome to the After Gambling podcast. My name is Jamie, and the last time I gambled was July 15th of 2010. Now, my guest today is celebrating a massive milestone in his recovery. Yes, today is 25 years. 25 years clean for Tom from his gambling addiction. So after you listen to the episode, you can reach out to Tom on Twitter. Tom, congratulations. And if you're interested, you can check out the links to his new novel. And he'll talk about his previous novel and his new novel, both which deal with gambling addiction in this episode. So without further ado, here is the chat that I had with Tom Brew. So I guess, Tom, a good place to start, I know you're an author, and we kind of had that in the intro, but tell us a little bit about the first book, because it's a novel, which when I saw that, I thought that was kind of interesting because we're so used to people sharing their own stories. But if you want, share a little bit about how you got into the novel, share a little background, and we can go from there.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was a newspaper reporter and an editor most of my life, and I was always on my bucket list to write a novel. And about 5 years ago, I first had an idea to do something that included like telling the novel, but also dealing with gambling addiction and its effects on people, because I didn't want to write my story quite yet, because quite frankly, it's not over yet. And, and so I thought about, being able to reach out, and then the group of people, in my 20 plus years of going around the country talking about gambling addiction, that the group of people that's always scared me the most are young kids, and college kids who get severely addicted to gambling at a young age and pretty much, can ruin their lives when they're 20 years old. And so I decided to, I had a good idea for a story, and I decided just to do that in fictional format. And obviously, Nick Vincent, who's the character in the book, who's a big-time college football player who gets hurt, and then while he's dealing with all that, just goes from being your regular everyday gambler to being someone completely addicted and over the top. And a lot of what he goes through in the novel is based on a lot of what I went through, in my 30s, when I had my year of just crazy off the charts gambling. And so I was able to sort of tell a little bit of my story, I guess, in a bit of a fictional format, really being able to focus on how quickly and easily it is to become addicted to gambling and becoming a compulsive gambler out of control, even though you've gambled, for long times prior to that, recreationally and without hurting anybody or anything. And so that was sort of the story, and kind of decided to do that. And once the idea got down, it all started to flow and put together a really, really nice book. It's called The Ties That Bind, and came out November of 2015. So it was right about 3 years ago now, and did really well, and been able to travel the country quite a bit talking about it, and I've done a lot of public speaking at colleges around the country. I've also done a lot of speaking about it, and of course my own story to treatment professionals around the country, and it's been very good and very well received, and it's been just a lot of fun for me to do.
Yeah, and we have a lot of shared connections, and I will mention right up here up front that we will put links to the book and to all your contact information in the show notes. So if anybody wants to go check that out, definitely highly recommend to go check out Tom's book. And we'll talk about, there's actually an upcoming book as well. But I guess share a little bit about, because we do have kind of the common interest of sports and that connection with sports and then gambling. And like you say, the book was kind of a way to tell your story through characters, through a novel. And that, like I said, that's fascinating to me. I guess if you want to share a little bit about your background with sports and then lead into sort of how you got into gambling.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. I was a journalism major in college at Indiana University, and started to make my first bets when I was in college, but they were obviously very, very small at the time, $5 here, $10 there. And I gambled just recreationally and very much off and on for the better part of 15 years. I mean, sometimes, my only gambling was on sports. I never went to casinos or anything like that. And if I went to the dog track or the horse track here in Florida, for an event or an outing one time, I might throw a few dollars on a race back then, but never really cared about it. And, but everything was always recreational and under control, never an issue, never a problem. But then when I was about 33 years old, I was in between my newspaper careers, and I was selling real estate at the time, and I started gambling on sports again a little bit, and it got to the point where it started to get a little bit more often and a little bit more serious, and really it was basically where it's sort of I'm sort of the odd bird in this a lot of times, in that my gambling addiction, quote unquote, was really very short lived. I mean, it took over my life and kind of wielded me out of control. But it was only in about a 9 or 10 month window where it just went from being totally fine and no big deal and never affected my life in any way to completely destroying my life just that quickly. And 93, I was just a sports bettor. I was living in Clearwater, Florida at the time. I was married, had 3 little kids, 6, 4, and 2. Had a very successful real estate career going. And I had bookmakers, here in Tampa. I had other guys around the country, and that I would place bets with, the old-fashioned way, pre-internet days. Dealing with your mafia-connected, bookmakers. And in March of '93, I met this guy in Tampa who was a bookmaker, who was a local guy. So I started to bet with him, and he paid me 15 weeks in a row, and I was always winning. And I did very well on college basketball in March. I did very well in the NBA playoffs. I used to bet. Baseball was my sport of choice when it came to gambling. I always did very, very well in baseball, and the whole summer was good and everything. And so because of that, the amount of my bets started to grow. And of course, with baseball, it's every day. It's not just Saturday or Sunday. And so the amount of money I was gambling got to be at a little bit higher pace. And then, of course, when September rolled around and football season started, then I was gambling at a higher pace, and then I had a lot more to bet on too. So I had pretty much by then stopped working, not intentionally, but just didn't even really realize it. I was so focused on my gambling all the time that my real estate sales business was just literally falling apart around me. And of course, I just blamed that on a bad market. I didn't blame it on the fact that I was pretty much either gambling or preparing to gamble, pretty much most of my waking time. And so by, a few weeks where I won and a few weeks where I lost, but for the most part, I was pretty anal about keeping track of my bets. I mean, I was still up, several $1,000s for the year. And what kind of makes me, kind of rare in the people that I've run across in 20 something years too is, a lot of compulsive gamblers are reluctant to use their gambling money for everyday expenditures. And I was exactly the opposite. If I needed $2,300 a certain week, to pay my mortgage or to pay car payments or things like that, if I was up 23 on Thursday, I'd quit for the week. I wouldn't make another bet, and I'd tell the guy, hey, I'm not going to bet anymore the rest of the week. I could use the money for the mortgage. Can we hook up? And we would. He liked me. I'd sent him a lot of business of people who lost a lot of money, so he liked me a lot. And, and I could do that. I could, if I was up and I had the money I needed, if I went a weekend without gambling, it was no big deal to me, and I could do that. But as the year progressed, then I started to have some misses. And and because I wasn't making any money in the way I used to make in my career, money got to be tight. So I was starting to chase, and it was basically robbing Peter to pay Paul a lot, and all that was going. And if there were weeks where I'd lose a couple $1,000, I would just borrow the money, then I'd win it the next week and pay it back, or then I would find another Peter to pay Paul with, and that cycle was just from really like November till about January, about a 2-month window where my life was just kind of crazy. And like I said, I was winning some and losing some during that, but every day was just a disaster. And then finally on January 23rd, 1994, was the day of the AFC and NFC championship football games. And I was firmly convinced, of course, that made thousands of dollars on Joe Montana through my life, and he was quarterbacking the Kansas City Chiefs at the time, and they were playing the Buffalo Bills, and I was firmly convinced there was absolutely no way the Buffalo Bills could go to 4 straight Super Bowls. So I had a lot of money bet on the Chiefs that day, and I was also convinced that the 49ers were ready to be better than the Cowboys, and so I bet them too, and of course missed them both, and lost about $2,500 that day, and I just didn't have it. And I ran out of friends named Peter that I could borrow money from, and there was really no other way to get it. And I ran around for a couple of days afterwards, begging and pleading with a lot of people. But by then, a lot of my friends just knew how sick I was and how out of control I was. And they all just basically started telling me no. So when Thursday came where I knew I was going to have to pay my guy, and remember now, this is a guy who paid me on time every time, all the time when I was winning, and there was just no way I could pay him. I had reached a panic mode where I just couldn't do this anymore. I was just so stressed out. I was only sleeping a couple of hours a day. It's yelling at my wife all the time, totally ignoring my kids, and it just was a mess. So I just couldn't do it, so I wrote a goodbye letter to my wife on my computer, and I grabbed some clothes and stormed out of the house. And she saw me as I was heading out the door, and she didn't understand the extent of what I was going through, but she knew something was up, and she was just yelling to me, please don't go, please don't go. Whatever's wrong, we'll fix it. And I just stormed right past her, threw my clothes in my car, and took off. And I started heading south towards St. Petersburg and the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, which attaches St. Petersburg to the Bradenton, Sarasota area. And I was going to stop my car and do the dive off the bridge and end it right there. And I got to US 19, and I had pulled in the right-hand lane to turn south, and the light was red. As I was sitting there waiting for the light, I waited for it to turn green, and for some reason, through no control of my own, when that light turned green, I drove across 5 lanes of traffic and drove north instead of going south. And I drove about 4 hours in my car, just crying the whole time, and I stopped at a rest area in Lake City, Florida, way up in the north part of Florida. Sat at a picnic table with a revolver next to me, just trying to figure out what the heck was going on in my life. And at that point, I sat at that table for about 3 hours, and it was cold. It was, like I said, January in North Florida, and I just was sitting there kind of freezing and shaking. And I told myself, I said, you know what, I really don't want to die, but I just can't live like this anymore. I was just that far out of control. So I threw that little $10 gun that I had bought at a pawn shop into a trash can and drove my car back to the corner. And there were these things back in the 90s called payphones. I don't know if you remember them, but I stopped there and I called my wife and I said, I need help. I'm just out of control and I need help. And this gambling has just gotten me into a mess. And she's like, come home and we'll get you help. And I decided to do that. I drove home, and when I got there was a gambling treatment professional named Tom Talley in my living room when I got there, and we had a long talk for several hours, and that was that. And that was the start. It was the end of my gambling and the start of my recovery that day. Thankfully, nearly 25 years later, I'm still here to talk about it. Thank God.
Yeah, and first of all, obviously, congratulations. I know you're coming up on a 25-year anniversary here in January, and that's incredible. We'll get into more of kind of your day-to-day in the last 25 years, but I want to just kind of focus on, you said this all happened in the span of like 8 or 9 months, correct?
Yeah. I mean, all my gambling prior to that was just, smaller amounts, kind of when I wanted, kind of when I didn't, just there was none of the addictive stuff to that at all. But then once I kind of got rolling, it became more and more of my day every day, and it got to the point where it was 24/7, all consuming. I was either gambling or preparing to gamble, or hanging out with other sick gamblers, all the time, and became a horrible father, horrible husband. Horrible friend, horrible, real estate agent to my clients, everything. I mean, had that quickly become that worthless of a person to everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, like me, I imagine, you kept everything in secret. Nobody else knew. I mean, they probably had an inkling that something was wrong. I mean, obviously, like your personality had changed. Like you say, you're being mean and aggressive and those types of things. But I mean, that's the other part of this addiction, which is always just kind of frightening to me, is that we're able to hide it and isolate so much. And yet, like you said, I mean, the moment you talk to your wife and she said, come home, and she's there with all this support and help. But it's just, I don't know. I think it's always great to share stories, and it's always fascinating to me just to kind of hear, because in that moment we don't see it.
Right. And, it's like when someone is an alcoholic and they drank way too much one day or night, you can see that they're drunk. And if someone is a drug addict and they've taken too much cocaine or heroin or whatever, and you can see how screwed up they are because you can see it. Well, when someone's in the throes of a gambling addiction, you can't see it. It's a lot of people, I know I was, and I'm sure you were too, are really, really good at hiding it all. And it's like I said, as long as I had, the robbing Peter to pay Paul stuff going, where my world didn't collapse, I was fine, and it's just like, I always just, money was, when my money was problems were prevalent and my wife could see that, I just blamed it on a bad real estate market. I didn't blame it on the fact, that I had lost, 4 games that Sunday by a half a point, those type of things. It's like, that was never a conversation. And it's like, I never gambled in front of her. Like she, for all of, all my stuff I did at my office, like all my, I kept, incredible data, on teams and stuff like that. It was all in my office and or all on my computer. Like she never, it wasn't like I sat around the kitchen table, saying I really need the Bears and the Packers to win today or stuff like that. It was never part of the conversation. Obviously I was a sports writer for years and years, so sports was always on TV anyway, and I was always, it was always on. But while I was watching a game and she was there in the house or whatever, it's like, if I had, $3,500 on the Patriots, one Monday night or whatever, I was watching the game. She had no idea, that was going on. And, but, towards the end, that's the way it was. I had gotten to the point, near the very end where during the course of the week, I was, betting as much as $15,000 or $20,000 a week. It had gotten that far out of control.
Yeah. And like you say, with sports writing, your profession is to study the sports, write about the sports. And that's where I think, obviously, that combined with those early wins, I'm sure you felt like, hey, I'm on top of this. I'm on top of the world. This is easy. That span, because it was your bread and butter.
Right. And I'm one of the few, we'll talk more about my recovery here in a bit, but in my 20-something years of going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings, I am one of the very, very few people I've ever met who actually won more money than they lost gambling. That didn't matter, because what it did was completely change my life. I've told the story, in thousands of meetings and speaking engagements all the time that, because I was really anal about keeping track of my bets. In that last year that I gambled, I finished about $8,500 ahead for the year. But my real estate commissions went from about $140,000 a year to 50. So so I could brag all I wanted about being ahead $8,500, but in reality, because of my gambling addiction, my income dropped by $90,000. So it's like, I can't pat myself on the back too much for winning more than I lost gambling, because it's what it does to your life, and it's what it does to your personality, and what it does to your motivation. And I just, I was really good at what I did. I've always been very good at what I've done in any kind of business, but, I just stopped. I just didn't care. What mattered to me was, making sure I had the right teams, every day or every night. And, I would sit at my desk at my real estate office for hours on end, going through stuff and studying and being prepared and calling bookmakers and playing lines all over the country and doing what I had to do, and it's like, I should have been out, working hard. There were, and, even worse, on Thursdays when I would settle up with my bookmaker, we met, at a strip club called the Dollhouse in Tampa, every Thursday, and here I was, a married man, 3 young kids, barely keeping my lights on. And, if someone wanted to see me to show them houses on a Thursday afternoon, forget it. I would always, tell them, some lie that, I was already had an appointment or stuff like that. I would never, even if I could go make, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 or whatever, I wouldn't even think about it, because I loved my Thursday afternoons at the Dollhouse too much with my bookmaker and all my other gambling buddies, settling up. Settle up Thursday at the dollhouse was my thing, and that's how stupid my life had become. It was just completely, out of control with, basically no good decisions being made.
I'm so glad that you shared all that, because it is. I was just on a podcast recently and was asked, can you be a problem gambler without having a financial problem? And my answer was, of course. Because looking back, and I'm sure you kind of appreciate this as well, like you say, you were one of the few people that won more than you lost. But it's all the other stuff. Every month paying off debts is the easy part for me. Looking back, it's the lost time with family and friends and all those other things. Trying to rebuild those character issues. That's the part that kind of stings the more, and a whole lot more than the financial loss. Yeah,
because you can always, I'll be the first to admit, financially, I'm still struggling 24 years later. But it's, you can always find a way, to make a living somehow, some way. And obviously, like now, when you don't have those big debts hanging over your head, or you don't have that craziness of lack of self-control and everything, you can be successful, in other parts of your life again. And, I'm very grateful, that I've had that opportunity to have a good, successful life since then. And I owe it all to the fact that I don't gamble anymore, and that I've worked hard on my recovery, and I've changed the type of person that I am. And that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and let's talk about your recovery, because obviously 25 years, you're doing a lot right to get to that number, and it's a day at a time. But I guess walk us through, what are some of the things that you've done in recovery that you continue to do? What are your thoughts there?
Well, a lot of, in the early going, a lot of it was just simply surviving. When my wife made that call and got a guy there, I went to my very first meeting on Super Bowl Sunday night. It would have been Super Bowl 28, Cowboys Bills. It's the only Super Bowl I've never seen in my life. I went to a meeting with there were 4 people there. There were 2 women in their 50s. I was 35 years old, and there was a kid. He was in college. He was 19 years old at his very first meeting too. And when I went to that meeting, the only reason I was going to that meeting was because my wife told me I had to go. I wasn't ready to do that for myself yet, even though I had just been through what I had been through, a couple of days earlier. But I went, and I had an open mind, and I read our little yellow book, and listened to these people talk, and in a matter of minutes, I realized I was in the right place. That my life had spun out of control, and I needed to turn my life around and turn it over to a higher power, and be involved with some people who could help me, end this craziness. And I gained a lot out of that. And, we'll talk about that more when it comes to the book, but that was kind of the impetus. That kid who was there, we never saw him again. And, he went to one meeting. He had been stealing money from his parents to support his gambling and stuff like that. He was a mess. And we never saw him again. And I always wondered what happened to that kid. He would have been about 43, 44 years old now. And I hope he had a good life. But we never saw him again. But one of the women in that group, she used to always get mad at me when I would talk about my first GA meeting at meetings. I would always say that it was just me and this kid and these 2 old lady bingo players. And she always got mad at me for calling her an old lady. But we went to meetings a lot, for a long, long time down here. And she's still my friend, and I still see her now and again. But I went to 56 meetings in 90 days. I had a treatment professional down here named Rick Benson, who had a recovery center called the Algamus Recovery Center down in Anna Maria Island, just south of me here. And he and I spent an enormous amount of time together, and I was just like I was addicted to gambling. The OCD in me, what really helped a lot is then I became addicted to recovering, and I am totally embraced the 12-step program. I totally embraced that I could fix my life pretty well if I stopped gambling and worked on things, and that was the goal. And I was given the opportunity to really do that, thanks to my wife in a different kind of way, because about 10 days after all this, there was a guy who was getting his 1-year pin, and he was a doctor, and his wife was there, and his 2 little kids were there too. And I saw all of me and him, and I was, while we went through that meeting, I was thinking, I can't wait, for a year down the road for me, so that I could have all that, normalcy back in my life again. But on the way home, my wife told me that she wanted a divorce, and the reason for that, she said, was that there were 3 things that were really important to her. One of them was that I fixed my addiction problem and fixed the type of person I was. And 2 was to be the best father that I could be to my 3 little kids. And the third most important thing to her was that I'd be a good husband to her. And she didn't think I was capable of doing all 3 of those things at one time. So she wanted to take that off my plate. And so we did. So I moved out the next day, and I worked real hard on being a father all the time to my kids, and worked real hard on my recovery. But we got divorced a few months later, and went through a few hiccups, that first year. But since then we've been really good parents together, and did all that. And she's 23 years and change later, we're still the best of friends. And my birthday was Sunday, and the very first phone call I got on Sunday from anybody was my ex-wife of 24 years. And it's those type of things. That first text was from her that morning. It's like, we have all that, but at the time that was it. And I went. That first year I just grinded and grinded. I had to switch professions because I just couldn't. I didn't want to be in that position anymore where I was working on a commission only job. I needed to pay bills, and switched around what I was doing, and had a lot of free time. So I went to a lot of meetings and spent a lot of time with Rick and a lot of some of the other people in the program, and just sort of embraced it all, and got through all that. And after about 14 months, I decided to take another job back home in Northwest Indiana, outside Chicago, just to try to get some stability going in my life again. And lived up there for 3.5 years, but did the same thing. Went to 3 or 4 meetings a week, for all that time, and missed my kids a lot though. So after right about 5 years into the program, I moved back to Florida, and more or less, I bounced around a little bit here and there, back and forth, depending on where jobs take me. But I've either lived in Florida or Indiana the entire time, and it's been, like I said, coming up on 25 years clean. So it's important to me to do that. But the biggest thing at the time was to just not make a bet. Was just find a way to not gamble that day. Because I knew I was just I had just this fear factor that I was always scared to death that if I relapsed, that I came close to death the first time, that I was sure I would kill myself the second time. And so it was just this sort of fear factor. And then we worked from there. And then right after my 1-year pinning, Rick and I really worked a lot. He told me he was proud of me for getting through my first year, but I was doing it for all the wrong reasons. The only reason I was abstaining from gambling was that I was just afraid of what would happen if I did. That I really needed to work hard on fixing me, too. And that sort of, we worked on some specific things, and that just sort of became my mantra that, I'm not going to make a bet today, and I'm going to work on being a better person. And because those things go, they're in a full circle. It's like you can't do one without the other. So I worked really hard on becoming a better person too, and I've always worked hard on being as good a father as I can, and doing what I can, and all that. It made it easier by having the right thoughts in my head every day. It made it easy to not gamble, which I guess, easy is the wrong word. I mean, it was not easy at the beginning, but it's made it easy, through the whole journey, that I just don't need that in my life. I can enjoy, watching a football game now on a Sunday and not have to be panicking about, the end result. I can just enjoy it for what it is. So it's been certainly an interesting journey, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you're right. Easy is not the right word, but I understand what you're saying, because over time, as you get time, and I think some of the other things, like the fact that you see yourself developing as a person, and you see, okay, hey, there was a lot of bad, obviously, that comes out of anybody's gambling addiction. If you get to GA, there's a whole lot of bad days that are there in your memory. But with time, I've found that it seems like you also realize and kind of appreciate, hey, anytime you go through struggle, you come out the other side a little bit better. And I think it sounds like that's kind of what you're saying as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's just, today is better than yesterday, and it just, that was, I've said that, for many, many years. I used to have people I knew who did gamble or whatever, when they would ask me something. It's like, to me, like every day I was plus zero every day, because the fact that I didn't make a bet was a positive. It wasn't a break even thing. It was a positive that that I wasn't gambling. Because it was amazing how much time I had to focus on things that mattered again, and it just it gave to spend 2 hours at a GA meeting 3 or 4 nights a week was nothing compared to the 8 or 10 or 12 hours I was wasting gambling or preparing to gamble before. So it was it was something that I could embrace too. And like I said, part of my addictive personality, I think I firmly believe that helped me recover the way I did, because it just became my thing. I liked being a part of it. I spent a good bit of time in year 2 training to be a gambling treatment counselor too. I thought maybe that might be something I might want to do for a career. So I did a lot of that, and of course, obviously as part of that, I've worked with between 12-step meetings and that, hundreds and hundreds of, compulsive gamblers and families and stuff like that. And all of that just made it more meaningful to me to be in a position where this is the life that I've chosen to live now. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. And I know I've personally experienced that helping other people. I mean, there's nothing like it. And it's amazing that you don't even need to do anything. Or like you said, you did some training on it, but literally just sharing your story. It's amazing what that does to help somebody else, and the feedback that you get is incredible.
Yeah. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't go to meetings nearly as much as I used to, nor probably should, just by the nature of, for a long stretch there, I was working, not to be an excuse, but I was working 2 full-time jobs, once my kids came back and lived with me for 4.5 years. So to make that happen, I was working like crazy, and getting to meetings, became less and less important to me. I'd still go every once in a while, and I still do every once in a while. But what I've kind of learned from that is that when I'm there and when I talk and share my stories, a lot of the people who know me, it's like, Tom, you need to be here more often, and not just for you, we need you. It's like that new person who walks in the door, they need you. And it's like, yeah, I know. And that's true. And it's like, I've, actually, that's one of my goals, for 2019 too, is to try to be more involved again, and have that be a little bit more of a priority in my life again, to get back to meetings and to spend more time with those friends. And I still spend a lot of time on the phone with people and stuff like that, but haven't gone to meetings nearly as much, and I need to do that. So it's on my list of 2019 goals. But we all need to have goals every year, and that's certainly one of them.
Absolutely. And in this day and age, I mean, there are definitely many other outlets. I mean, there's Twitter, there's Reddit, there's all sorts of online things, like you say, you're doing others. It's getting that mix and what's right for you. And so I guess let's segue into obviously the book and the writing. Tell me a little bit about the upcoming book, how that plays into your story, recovery, what's your goals for it, etc.
Yeah, the next book is a sequel to the first, and it's called Darkness, and it basically picks up where the first book, The Ties That Bind, left off. And without spoiling the story on the first one too much, I won't go into the real specifics. But basically, what the second book is really what it really focuses on is relapse, and focuses on what happens when you quit working hard, at your recovery, and basically, the lead character in Darkness, that's what happens. Sort of stops going to meetings, stops being around, stops caring about what anybody thinks, and all of a sudden, he starts doing things that he was basically a sports bettor like me prior to that, but then he started playing poker, thinking that's that's a game of skill. It's not really gambling. It's not something he was ever addicted to before, and that would be okay. But then one thing after another happens, and his life gets really crazy and spins out of control even worse. And the goal of that story is to tell people, and this from living it and seeing it, is that when people relapse, it's always worse the next time around. I mean, no one ever relapses easy. It's always worse. And And in this book, the goal of this book is to show that, as to how easy you can fall right back into that trap if you're not careful. And there's lots of action and drama in this book too, like the first one, and quite frankly, the story in the second one, I love it even more than the first, because a lot of the characters who are involved, you already know them, and so there's a lot of drama in chapter one of the sequel. So I'm excited about that, and it's something I wanted to write sooner, but once I started writing other books on other topics, and then starting my book publishing business, I've always joked with people that as the owner of my publishing company, the writer that I treat the worst is me. So I've written 4 books total, and edited and published 8 others in the last 3 years. So it's this sequel has been dragging, but it's basically done now, and I'm going to release it on January 23rd, which is the 25-year anniversary of my clean date. So that's the day it comes out, and I'm literally, like I said, just putting the finishing touches on it right now, and be looking forward to a big release in January.
Yeah, and I really love the title, first of all. I mean, darkness, that's one of the best ways, I think, to describe any addiction. Like you say, I mean, kind of the fears, and that all kind of leads into that imagery. But then it almost, I mean, in hearing you talk and kind of drawing on some of the things we talked about earlier, it's almost like this book is sort of like revealing some of your fears, right, of recovery. That, okay, if I don't go back, and it's
granted, obviously a lot of it is just to play to the drama of the story, and but what the kid goes through next is, it all could have happened to me, it all could have happened to you, it all could have happened to hundreds of people that you and I know, and now obviously he really goes off the rails, huge, and just really becomes just a horrible person doing horrible things, and that's what happens, and it's and I want to show that and share that, and and that's important to me, because it's a lot of times people look at me, it's like, you don't gamble anymore, that's great, and it's like, but if I did, this is what would happen, and it would not be pretty, and and that's part of it. So it's and like I said, the story itself, it starts right here in Clearwater, Florida, and it plays out the middle chunk of the book is all set in Biloxi, Mississippi, where I have some experience with as well, and then the last of the drama plays out in Las Vegas, in what would be the equivalent of a World Series of poker craziness, and so it's all that. So I think anybody who's had any sort of gambling issues, will probably see a little bit of themselves in this character, and or be grateful that they don't. So it's and like I said, it's been good, because what I've really appreciated about the first book is the writer in me has always been grateful that a lot of people who've read it, don't know a darn thing about gambling addiction and don't know what can happen to that. And they just appreciated it for the story and the quality of the writing. And that always meant a lot to me. And I'm hoping that everybody feels the same way about the second one.
Yeah, and I'm definitely looking forward to catching it on January 23rd when it comes out. And I do think it's an incredible way and a cool platform, like you say, to have a novel to kind of tell the story of gambling addiction. It's just it's another way, any way that we can kind of get people up to speed, because so few people truly understand it. And like you summed up very eloquently, that people don't understand. They look at you and say, Tom, you have 25 years clean. What do you have to worry about? And yet you and I are sitting here saying, no, I worry every day. And so kind of it's cool to hear that this is going to kind of highlight some of those thoughts and fears, but also just kind of tell it in a different way that is through novel, through fiction, to kind of introduce more people.
Sure. Yeah. And what's always been real important to me was to be able to continue the conversation, and it's like, because I tell people all the time, I say, I am not anti-gambling in any way. I'm just anti-gambling for me, and it's like, I go on my brothers and I and a bunch of friends go on a golf trip every year. Started as a way to celebrate my youngest brother's 40th birthday. And we go to Biloxi, Mississippi in March every year. And people have always said, you don't gamble. What's it like for you to be around a casino? And I always say, well, it doesn't bother me one bit, because I never did any casino gambling. It doesn't, I'm not attracted to it in any way. I'm I don't have any addiction issues when it deals with that, and I know who I am, and I just I let them. They have their fun, and they're all good about it. And I play golf and have my nice dinners, and I'll have a drink with them all now and again. It's one of my favorite weeks of the year, and it all takes place in a casino, and I never think twice about it. And it's like, but what's funny this year when we're going, I was reminded by one of my brothers that the casino that we stay at now in Mississippi has. They do have sports book now. They just it was legalized this year, and they have one. And he's like, "Is that going to be an issue for you?" And I know what I am, and I know what what I always tell people is that I'm a recovering compulsive gambler, and there's nothing wrong with that because I know who I am, and I know what I need to do to deal with it. And so it's like it doesn't matter to me. I would think I can gamble on sports, while we're on the phone here, if I so chose. I mean, it's just that easy anymore. But so the fact that there's a sports book there doesn't bother me one bit. I'm going to go there to hang out with my brothers and my friends and play golf every day and eat nice dinners every night and just have a really good time. And it's that's what the joy of recovery gives you, is that you can do that and live a good, fun life again.
Absolutely, and I'm glad that you found that freedom. And I just want to say thanks for coming on.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. As I said in the intro, if you want to reach out to Tom, tell him congrats, or check out one of his books, you can do so by looking in the show notes. And then also, I just thought it was interesting to have Tom on with his background in sports and sports betting. Given all of the change that we see here in the United States, hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully you found it interesting. And just really appreciate Tom coming on and sharing his story, because that's what it's all about. Now, remember, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an attorney. Please seek out professional help to deal with your gambling addiction. We talk about stuff, we want to raise awareness for it, but gambling is an addiction. It's a severe disorder, so please reach out and get the help that you need. And then finally, the music for the show is Something Elated by Broke for Free and is licensed under the Creative Commons license. My name is Jamie. Last time I gambled was July 15th of 2010. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.